Mike and I suffered a few latency issues between Spain and the UK, which should in no way reduce your enjoyment of our conversation. Let me say this about Mike. In 2016, Mike received the inaugural Sir George Martin Award. He was presented the award by Damon Albarn of Blur and Gorillaz. Albarn said of Mike, "I would trust him with my life. He's a rare, rare gem in this world." Here's Mike's story.
I only wanted to work with bands. I wasn't interested in pop artists. I wasn't interested in solo artists. If you're in the business of spotting talent, and that might be executive talent as much as musical or artistic talent, it's all about spotting people that have got that drive and that ambition to succeed. I'm a great believer in whatever you want to do in life, don't wait for somebody to offer you the job. Just go out and do it.
Mike, welcome to the Job for Journey podcast. It's great to have you on today.
Lovely to be
here. Mike, you and I have known each other many, many years. But actually, as I came to do this research, this podcast, and thinking, and just to introduce you, I came across the word legend, which was, something. I'm sorry to blush you make you blush in the first 5 minutes. But Mike, let's just to introduce Mike. Mike's been in the music industry for over 35 years. Started MCA Publishing, worked his way up from back office through to being an A&R man, discovering talent. That's led him through a publishing journey. We actually worked his way up to senior management, hopped over to the record industry, made even greater strides, hopped back into publishing and has recently left it at the top, but still has not left the industry, and is also pursuing a few other hobbies or passions that he's had through his whole life: drawing, painting, and writing. So we're going to cover all those today. Mike, welcome to the podcast again.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Pete. It's lovely to see you.
Mike, I always associate you with music because for two reasons. One, we were in your car, in your Beetle, charging around Manchester, listening to the Cars and all sorts of 80s tunes. And also, Mambo Square and Mrs. Mill's Party were just like, probably bored other people about the amount it was talked about when we were at university. But even going one step back, what's the 14-year-old Mike Smith? Music, drawing, writing, what's he doing? What's he thinking about? And how's he spending his time?
Well, I mean, I came to music, I think, watching, with my dad, watching the Eurovision Song Contest when I was much younger than that. And I think the first real big impact on me was watching ABBA win the Eurovision Song Contest in 1974. The combination of a truly amazing song with Waterloo and the visual impact of Agneta and Annie Fried was mind-blowing to my, how old would I have been, 8-9-year-old self. So that really got me hooked, and I think I immediately went out and got ABBA's Greatest Hits straight on the back of that. And the other big influence for me growing up, I grew up in Merseyside. I was born in Birkenhead and grew up on the Wirral. So the Beatles loomed huge over me when I was a child. It was a big thing in Merseyside in the 70s. So you never really escaped from it. And the amazing thing with the Beatles is that a friend of mine, Gem Archer from Oasis, always describes them as the greatest story ever told, the Beatles story. And in many ways it is. It's such a brilliant tale of how, it's the most romantic tale of how a band comes together from a bunch of young lads. They go to Europe, they hone their craft, they come back, they get a manager, they're playing great shows in Liverpool, go to London, try and get a deal. First person passes on them, somebody takes a risk, and they go on to be the biggest band in the world, conquering America. They quit playing live when everyone says they should carry on, and then go on to make some of the most remarkable records. And then at the peak of their fame, they quit and finish. What a remarkable story. So I knew all that as a 12-year-old. And then how lucky you and I are to be of an age where 12, 13-year-old punk rock arrives. And I just, the great thing about punk rock is that it was super visual. It was all about attitude. It was all about rebellion. But it was all about great songs. The songs that came through at that time sounded fantastic because it was a whole generation that had grown up on rock and roll, on the Beatles, on the Stones, so that everybody really had great songcraft. They looked terrific. They had fantastic attitude. So suddenly for that to connect with me just at the right age, I was 13 in 1978, which was really when punk was turning into new wave and was really blossoming into something amazing. And I just became obsessed with the charts, following it religiously. But interestingly, at the same time, I think by the time I was 14, which is where the question comes in, I wanted to be a little bit different. And even though the first sort of like tape I think I bought for myself was a bootleg copy of Blondie's Parallel Lines, by the time I was 14, I wanted to be different from everybody else that was listening to punk and new wave. So I was into slightly more heavier rock. I was into things like Motorhead and AC/DC and Judas Priest and, the kind of unfashionable stuff that I probably don't boast too much about. One of the first bands I ever went to see live was UFO at the Liverpool Empire, and I saw Whitesnake at the Royal Court. It was looking back, I'm hugely jealous of friends of mine that were going to see Ian Dury at Deeside Leisure Centre, or were seeing Spiz Energy and the Psychedelic Furs at Eric's in Liverpool. It's a fantastic little club, Eric's. And I was going off and seeing all these heavy rock bands. But it was just, that's where my head was. And I liked the idea that I was listening to music that not everyone else was listening to. And I was also discovering things. I was really into Def Leppard in sort of like 79, 80. So like there was this whole new wave of British heavy metal coming through at that time. So I got into all of that, but it's something I don't normally talk about because it's not very cool. And interestingly, when I moved, my dad's job, like everybody else, was his factory where he's working shut down on the Wirral and moved to Bristol. And so I was starting at a new school, and I turned up and wanted to be in with the cool kids at the new school, and realized very quickly that heavy metal was not going to cut any ice. So I sort of like went, not cool at, I mean, I won't say what people refer to it as, but I had to go through a kind of like Stalinist reinvention. And I had 1 week, and I think I saw Jake Burns from Stiff Little Fingers. He had a new band called The Big Wheel. I saw The Alarm, and then I saw The Clash at Bristol and Colston Hall. And I think after that, I went out and sold all my heavy rock records and just had a Stalinist like reinvention, and really threw myself wholeheartedly into reconnecting with punk and new wave, but also at that time, which was 83, 84, all of this amazing sort of like post-punk that was coming through.
Actually, but I remember records were expensive, right? And like you, I wasn't into heavy metal, but I wanted to look cool. And, I wanted to buy Dire Straits, making movies. And it's like, that was it for that 3 months. 10 quid on an album was, or 6 quid probably back then, but it felt like 10 quid. You had to make your choices, didn't you, in terms of what you bought and what you listened to?
Or you relied on other people. And
absolutely,
at school, everyone would be carrying around an album like a badge of honor. That was the way you identified yourself. And you would lend people albums. And you could, whilst an album would cost you, like you say, 10 quid, you could get a Woolworths C90 for less than £1. And that was 2 albums that you could get on that. And I used to sit there as well by the top 40 countdown each week, and I would religiously record what was on the chart that I liked, which, and I think that really got my brain into a place of, to be honest, I didn't like most of the music in the chart, but there was always enough there in the chart that I loved. And I think that's the way I've always thought about music. If, trying to hear music that can hopefully have success, but also is music that I'm really passionate about.
And that took us to university, and you were studying let's say a normal arts degree, but your friends in Mrs. Mill Party and Mambo Square, I mean, everyone was wearing black, everyone had DMs. But do you think your past, having been at school, do you think that then catapulted you to say, well, I want to work with these, apart from them being our mates, I want to work with these people, I want to be part of this, and I don't just have to listen to records, I can do a bit more in these circumstances?
No, absolutely. I so wanted to be part of it. And at school, I'd wanted, my friends were just starting to get bands together. They were certainly playing music all the time. And I'm not musical. I've got fingers like bananas. I can't play a guitar. I can hammer out chords on a piano, but I'm not. I didn't want to be a musician. I loved drawing. I loved painting, and for me, my idea of heaven was being with a bunch of musicians and just sitting in the corner and drawing them. That's what I loved doing, and that's what I did when I was a teenager all the time. And so I get to university. I think within 2 or 3 days of being there, I met Ben Wardle. Went on to has gone on to be one of my closest friends, and the conversation went very quickly to, what music do you like? You're from Southeast London. Do you know Squeeze? He did know Squeeze. Southeast London. God, the Clash played the Lewisham. You were at the Lewisham Odeon when the Clash played there in 1978. So immediately, Ben was a bit of a hero to me within minutes of talking to each other. And also, we met each other. He was wearing a leather jacket. I was wearing kind of like a black military jacket. So you just knew you were probably going to get on with each other from the clothes that you were wearing. And then as soon as you start having a conversation about music, you're off. And then I'd go to his room, and he had a kind of Gretsch semi-acoustic bass guitar, and would be playing that. And he really wanted to get a band together at university. He'd been in bands when he was at home in Southeast London. So I was immediately drawn to all that. And by the second term at university, him and a group of other friends who I'd started to get to know formed a band, formed Mrs. Mills Party. And I would sit in the corner. They rehearsed in the kitchens at Owens Park, which was the hall of residence we lived in. And I would sit there and draw pictures of them. But when they had their first gig, and they asked me to do all their publicity, so I would design posters for them and put them up all around the university. And then I had the idea, well, why don't I go on stage with them? And I used to paint big pictures behind them. And I think we did a thing at the Owens Park. There was an Owens Park review. I was in a band called the Da Vinci's. And we just did a version of Not Fade Away by Buddy Holly. And I painted a huge picture of the Mona Lisa with sort of like black emulsion on a huge canvas behind the stage. So after that, I started doing these big paintings behind Mrs. Mills. And that was my way of being in the band, doing my artistic thing whilst they made music. But Ben left the band. They wanted to take it a bit more seriously. Having probably an inebriated artist up on stage with them wasn't their idea, and I was probably more of a liability than an asset. And that's when Johnny and Guy, who were my housemates, were starting to get Mrs. Mills, Mambo Square together. And I heard some of the music that they were working on, and it was probably much more to my taste than Mrs. Mills Party. Mrs. Mills Party were quite a kind of dark, psychedelic goth band, whereas Mambo Square was much more lighter, influenced by Talking Heads and XTC and Bob Dylan. And I really, really loved them. And it's interesting you say about everybody wearing black. I remember the first gig that Mambo Square did, which was at Swinton Catholic Comprehensive School, where Mike the drummer went there. They came on stage and they're all wearing white linen jackets. So they looked like a boy band. They looked so good. They were really good looking guys in that band. They all had spiky hair. They all had great clothes. And I was over the moon when they came up to me a few weeks later and said, "Do you want to manage the band?" And I just thought, this is what I want to do. And so I started getting them gigs, pushing the demo around to everybody, sending the demo off to record companies, off to radio stations, off to local music magazines. And again, just sort of like following the blueprints of what the Beatles did or what I'd read about the Susie and the Banshees or whatever that they'd done to get deals. And I loved it. And it was my way of being involved with music without actually having to write songs or I
listened to it again the other day. I mean, there's some real funk to what they played as well. I mean, and one question I was going to ask you is actually, Mrs. Mills and Mambo Square. I mean, they were good musicians. I mean, forget whether you like the songs or not, which we did, but they were good musicians. And do you think that helped you when you went out looking at bands in, parts of Camden and Brixton and all over? Do you think the fact that you'd actually been with bands that were good helped you work out what was good post-university, you know, because they weren't just thrashing 2-chord songs at all. It was quite sophisticated stuff.
No, they were serious about what they wanted to do. And I was thinking about it today. One of my regrets is that we never did a record.
Yeah.
You know, we should have put a record out, you know, and I think if I could have, as the manager, I wish I'd have persuaded Mambo Square to get a single out. I think if we'd have done that, I think it would have got John Peel play, might even have got onto, you know, the evening session with Janice Long. And I think we, you know, and it might have persuaded them to keep the band going. And it was a real regret of mine that the band did call it a day at the end of university. And it was just like, well, Frog, the bass player, was going to be an architect. Johnny was going off to teach English in Spain. You know, so it everything fractured. And I think, as well as which, I remember Guy was the principal songwriter, the guitarist in the band. Him and Johnny were the main songwriters. And I remember Guy saying to me, you know, towards the end of university, I don't want to do this. To be honest, he was doing a production course, and he just said, I want to concentrate on production. I want to be behind the desk. I don't want to be the one with the responsibility of writing songs and being a pop star.
No criticism, but I mean, to be honest, I think it's probably a 49-51%. If Guy had been in, it probably would have flipped the other way, because I mean, he was, and again, it's not a test, but he probably was the best musician in the band, whatever that means. I mean, he was so naturally talented, and if he had given any inclination,
he is. I mean, it really did break my heart, and I tell you, that's the biggest lesson in many ways that I learned, is that it isn't all about musical ability. You know, the difference between Mambo Square making it and not making it wasn't that, you know, was Johnny a good enough singer? Were they good enough musicians? Were the songs good enough? Did they want it enough?
No.
And they didn't. They didn't. If, you know, I'm sure if, you know, one or two of the record companies that approached us, if they'd have actually come in and said, we think you're great, we want to sign you to a deal, then I think everybody would have been all in. But because I couldn't land them a deal in the time that we were working together at university, I think Guy went on and just thought, you know what, I want to be on the other side. And interestingly, pretty much not long after we'd finished at university, Guy and myself and a lad called Jeff Foster, who had produced the Mambo Square demos, we were talking about getting a production company together. And we were calling it Eviction, because the studio in which we were doing a lot of recording at that time was getting evicted from its premises. But we got this idea together for a little business called Eviction that was going to be a production company. We'd go in, we'd find artists, we'd make records, and then we would sell those records onto major labels. That was our plan. So I think very quickly, Guy and I were pivoting into, well, we can do this as a business. In the end, it didn't happen because Jeff went off to Thailand. Guy was studying more on the sound production side, and I ended up getting a job at MCA initially as a postboy, but really targeting trying to be a talent scout. So we were sort of like breaking up. I mean, it's interesting. I did a recording with Ben Wardle, and I was a vocalist in a band that he had called Walk on Hands. And after university, he came down to London. He did a year extra beyond me. So I was already working as a talent scout by the time Ben came down to London. And he was, why don't we get the band together? And because I knew we weren't good enough, listening to all the other demos, and probably I didn't want it enough, I said, no, we're just not good enough. And I really regret that. And I think it's a shame that a lot of people just don't join bands and have a laugh. And I think, interestingly, that was the great thing about Mambo Square and Mrs. Mill's Party. It was a great laugh. Big part of what we did at university. And I think, you know, I went to university, I studied history and politics. was going to university useful for my career? Well, it turned out it was, because I spent all my time hanging out with musicians and learning the craft in a way
No, I mean, my son is a
unintentionally.
guitarist and primarily a drummer. And I don't know if you saw a few weeks ago when Knock Loose went on Jimmy Kimmel, and it went like half of the world loved it and half of the world
Yeah,
hated it. And so my son and his band decided to learn it, borrowed a girl singer from another band. Everyone in the audience probably hated it, but they're like, you're only 19 once, we're going to play Knock Loose. And we're going to play Knock Loose.
exactly. Got to do it.
Yeah,
No, no,
no,
no. I
we've got to
love
be
that.
careful, Mike. We may not get beyond the 80s. So, but, so we leave university. And I think, an interesting point here is, I think you and many of us at university, we were the first generation of our families that had gone to university, right? And our parents had worked quite hard.
Yeah.
I mean, there's still a few grants around, but basically our parents were subsidizing our university even back then. And as you said, people went off to be journalists or teachers or accountants. And you have to come back and at some point tell your parents you want to work as a post boy in a publishing company.
Yeah.
How did that go down? And what kept the faith from your perspective that actually I think this is the right thing to do, to be honest?
Been down a lot of roads with my parents, particularly my father. And it is that thing of, I was the one that had the opportunity to be the first person in the family to go to university. When I was 17, I really wanted to go to art school and I wanted to be a painter. And that just was not cutting any mustard at home. And I get it. My mum and dad were obviously thinking, it's an incredibly difficult way to make a living, trying to paint pictures. You've got to be kidding. They didn't know anyone. It's not like me. I know plenty of people that have had fantastic careers as painters, but my family didn't. They knew a couple of people that did a graphic design, maybe designed labels or kitchens or whatever, but they didn't know anyone who wanted to do what I wanted to do. So that was really flatly ruled out. And I didn't stand up for myself and I didn't fight it through. I didn't want to fall out with my mum and dad. So I ended up studying something that I liked, which was history and politics, and that was fine. Coming out of university, though, there was a tremendous amount of pressure of sort of like getting a serious job, doing a graduate trainee scheme. But by then, I'd had 3 years of living on my own, away from my parents, and they didn't have the same level of influence and control over me. And I want to see if I can make a career in the music business. And I really, really wanted to do A&R. I wanted to be involved in the discovery of talent and the nurturing of talent. And I'd seen people building really good careers doing that. I knew it could be done. And I had a belief in myself that, I'd spotted things before they were successful and would watch them go on to be successful. So there was a part of me that felt I could really do this. Plus, I felt I had the knowledge and the love of music to do it. And my dad actually took me away. We went away on holiday to Amsterdam for a weekend, specifically so he could persuade me to drop out of... This was actually after I'd had a hit single as well, but he was trying to persuade me to drop out of the music business and do something more sensible. And by then, I was just like, no, there's just no... I loved it so much. Being a talent scout was everything I wanted to do with my life. And it's interesting. I'd say I loved it. The flip side of that is that it's an incredibly tiring and challenging life and a very sort of like paranoid existence. I mean, the wonderful thing about the music business is there is a chart. You sign an act, you are judged on whether that act gets into the chart, gets to the top of the chart. So there's no... in so many other jobs, it's a bit opaque whether you're doing well or you're not doing well. In the music business, it's really, really glaringly obvious when you're doing well. I come in and I did a bunch of really entry-level jobs. I was a washer and an Arthur Andersen accountant. I literally crossed the T's and dotted the I's on technical documents at Unilever for Lux Soap. I did all those kind of temporary jobs, and then the temp agency I was with said, we've got a job at Universal Pictures as a postboy, are you interested? And it was just like, well, that's Universal Pictures, that sounds great, it's glamorous, I'll take that, and grabbed it. And within the offices of Universal Pictures, there was a music publishing company, MCA Music. And I was just like, this is amazing. So every night I'd be up there going through, I would lock up the building at night as part of my job. So I was the last one in the building, and I would be going through all the papers and files of the guys that worked in the publishing company. And I got to discover from that what an A&R man was. I'm a great believer in whatever you want to do in life, don't wait for somebody to offer you the job. Just go out and do it. And that's the way that you'll hopefully become a musician or writer, a painter, or an A&R guy. And that's, even though I was a post boy, I was going out and pretending to be a talent scout, going out and seeing all the new up-and-coming bands. And by doing that, I got to know all the other talent scouts in London and was, in fact, doing the job. And by doing that, when an opportunity came up to be a talent scout at MCA, I was already doing that job. So it was an easier step for me to make into that role.
And do you feel that you observed what other people did and felt, I could do it better, or I could do more, or I could do it differently? Was that in the equation of trying to stand out and differentiate yourself, as you know, in those early days?
I think I was very idealistic about music. And probably quite arrogant in terms of I knew what I liked, I knew what I loved. And like I said, it wasn't, a lot of people approach A&R going, I'm just going to have a hit. I just want to have a hit. And for me, there was much more of a mission. It was about finding music that I loved that I could get into the top 40. And there weren't, the late 80s wasn't a great time. There was a lot of ersatz, blue-eyed soul, lots of people trying to be George Michael. It was quite an anemic time. There were a few interesting artists. Yeah. We'd had the Smiths, the Jesus and Mary Chain were beginning to make an impression. REM were probably, and there's a band that we saw a lot at Manchester University, but they were one of the few examples of a band coming through from the underground that were becoming a mainstream success. But there weren't many examples. I knew I only wanted to work with bands. I wasn't interested in pop artists. I wasn't interested in solo artists. I wasn't really interested in dance music at that time. I loved hip hop, but I knew I didn't really understand the culture enough to want to work with it. But I really understood the independent scene and the alternative scene and the band scene. So for me, I had a very clear agenda. I wanted to sign bands, and I wanted to be able to take those bands from the underground and into the mainstream. And the great thing was, in 1989, after a period when there weren't many examples of that happening, the Stone Roses came through. And again, a band that were just starting when we were at university in Manchester. Suddenly, I remember I was up in Manchester, and by now my friend Ben Wardle from Manchester, he's working as an A&R guy as well. He's a talent scout over at Warner Brothers. And because my company, MCA, wasn't the most affluent of music publishing companies, so I would invariably hitch a ride with Ben when he went out of time, and I'd crash on the floor of his hotel room because my company didn't do expenses very well. And we woke up one morning and She Bangs the Drums was on Radio 1 at like 8:30 in the morning, and it was just like, oh my God, it's all happening. Finally, the music that we love is going mainstream. And that was a hugely exciting moment. And then a few weeks later, on Top of the Pops, the Stone Roses and the Happy Mondays were on the same show. And it suddenly felt like there was a shift. And it went from the music that I loved and that Ben loved being underground, suddenly started to go into the mainstream. And that kind of baggy guitar music in Spiral Carpets, Stone Roses, Happy Mondays suddenly became mainstream. And my boss at the time, before that, I'd been bringing every kind of music under the sun in. That, somebody's looking at it, I play it to my boss and say, what do you think? My boss sits me down and actually said to me, the kind of music that you love is actually going to go mainstream. I just want you to concentrate on that. I think the Charlatans had just had a big hit with The Only One I Know. And that gave me carte blanche to just focus on what I loved. And the timing was really good. And, the first band that I discovered after we'd had that conversation was Blur. So it gave me, if we hadn't had that conversation, maybe I wouldn't have been as all in as I was when I got to see Blur before.
Is Blur before or after Nirvana in terms of the official? I mean, obviously they were big after Nirvana, but is the signing pre or post or in conjunction with?
No, it's post. And so Ben and I are living together in a tumble down house in South London, And he comes in and he plays me Bleach, which is the debut album by Nirvana on Sub Pop. And we've been listening to a lot of sort of like American underground stuff, interested about which ones were going to come through. And it was Ben that really pulled out and went, you know what? These guys have got a melodic sensibility about them that's a bit more interesting than the other American sort of like heavy rock alternative bands that are coming through. And Ben definitely, spotted them as something that was interesting. But to be honest, most A&R people were not looking at the kind of Seattle bands at all. It was seen as, it was out there, but people weren't really signing those acts. I think, Husker Du had been signed to Warner's. The Replacements had been signed to Warner's. So they were like the first two alternative acts to really come through. Then Sonic Youth signed to Geffen. So that's when it was starting to be that point when those acts were signing. But certainly, when I signed Blur, I probably had in the back of my mind a feeling that they could be as big as the Stone Roses. And the kind of music that they were playing at that time, it was a mixture of sort of like art school punk rock and a more chart-friendly, baggy groove that I think the record label, Food Records, was definitely encouraging them to follow. So it was very at odds with what Nirvana were doing. But that was in 1990. And obviously the following year in 1991, Nevermind is released, and that's like an atomic bomb. It absolutely blows the industry apart. What was, the UK scene, sort of like baggy bands from Manchester, it's pretty much over after that. And in America, the kind of hair metal sunset strip bands,
Poisoner and Winger,
all gone.
they're all out,
and
right?
It's fascinating. Yeah. They never really came back. It was fascinating during the 90s. I'd see these A&R men that had phenomenal success signing Guns N' Roses and Motley Crue and Poison, and they just looked like military veterans on the battlefield, shell-shocked, wondering what the hell had happened. Yeah, completely. And suddenly there's all these new guys running around with baseball hats on back to front, plaid jackets.
I think it's one of those, I can't remember the parallel, but, everyone says now that they were into Nirvana, right? But I remember, a friend of mine went to do the old ski chalet thing, chalet in the morning, ski in the afternoon. And a friend of mine, he's like 23 years old, and he goes out to the nightclub in Verbier or wherever he's doing his skiing, and the Nirvana comes on. It's the 20-year-olds that go nuts. The 23-year-olds are not going nuts, and I think people forget music can be a very narrow window of I'm into it versus I missed it. The people who think they love Nirvana at the time is probably twice the world's population. It's just not true, basically.
Yeah, it definitely had a way. It was something new to own, and I think for a whole generation of kids,
Absolutely.
It was a great thing for them to grab hold of. But at the same time, the label Geffen that Nirvana worked with were very clever in putting them together with some really good producers and mixers, and made a record that is a very commercial record. And Kurt Cobain is a brilliant songwriter, and also they're an amazing looking band. Kurt looks like an angel. So you've got everything you need for a fantastically successful pop group there. Great songs, great looking, distinctive
And
vocal.
I took us down that sort of like side route, which is slightly away from your path, Mike, because, we can say it now, but you signed, one of the two biggest bands of the last 30 years. I mean, I thought this morning, I can't see beyond Blur and Oasis as a British band of the last 30 years signed up. And you can debate that, of course, but... Well, I'm going to come on to the Arctic Monkeys because I know you signed them as well, and I think I put them as three. I put them as three. Honestly,
I think Coldplay would probably argue, and sadly, not sadly.
Yeah, but I suppose my point is, what was it like in Nirvana time? Everything's blown up differently. What made you see Blur as these guys are special? And obviously a bit of 20/20 hindsight now. They are a massive band, or were a massive band. What did you see, and what do you think your path up to then enabled you to identify? I think my experience has got this right. My gut feel is this band could be big.
But the first time I saw them, it was pretty chaotic. I mean, it was at the Bull and Gate in Kentish Town, small pub in North London, and they used to have new bands on there every night. And they were jumping all over each other. The music was, as I said, very art school, discordant, messy. But the singer was a really striking-looking guy. In fact, the front row was really good-looking. Graham on guitar, Alex on bass, Damon. Damon was swinging from the rafters in this small bar in the audience. It was a really dynamic, exciting show, but it was chaotic, and I couldn't really work out the music. So I wasn't sure, but there was something there. And they were doing a residency, so I went back the following Friday, to see them again. And every single song that they played, I remembered from the week before, and it just suddenly struck me. These songs are actually great. It's messy, it's discordant, but these songs are really clever. I just love what they're doing. And for me, my perfect music is somebody that takes a really beautiful piece of music, a beautiful pop song, and then twists it and distorts it and wrecks it and messes it up to within, the point of almost complete lack of recognition, but there's still enough of that pop kernel in it to be special. And I think that's what Blur were really good at. They had a pop sensibility there, and they pushed it to the absolute limits. And then I think the third time I saw them, I remember watching them play "She Is So High," which is their first single, and I just thought, oh my God, that's like hearing the Stone Roses. That's as good as something by the Stone Roses. And that's when I just thought, they look amazing. They could be a Southern Stone Roses. So to me, that was the obvious thing to go to. And suddenly, here is and I think after 3 or 4 gigs, I was all in and literally on the bus with them, traveling around the country with them, spending every single minute with them. And I'd been a talent scout by that point for 3 years. And I just thought, if I'm in this band, I'm not going to have a career in the business. This is my one. And I'd missed out. I'd discovered a few bands. I discovered a band I discovered Ride. I discovered the Archers. I discovered the Senseless Things. So I'd felt that I'd had these things in my hands and they'd slipped through my fingers, and so I was really worried that I was going to lose Blur. And by the time we were about to sign them, a lot of other companies had come on board and were chasing at the same time. And Virgin offered, I think we offered 80,000 for Blur, and Virgin offered 105. And in the end, I was so lucky that Damon made that call to come with me, and he called up the guy from Virgin and said, "Look, I'm sorry, we're gonna sign with Mike Smith, because if we don't, I really do think he's going to kill himself." And it felt like that to me. I mean, I would go to bed every night and pray that I was going to sign this band. It was absolutely everything.
And there's a couple of things.
I've
read a couple of articles and listened to a couple of things, Mike, and I think the parallels with any career is, I think one thing I read about, you said, is many of my peers never went to the second gig. So the fact that you thought chaos first gig, but the fact that you remember the songs, that's your first inclination. And secondly, this passion for, as you say, you're probably not encouraging obsessive behavior, but that was one of in any career, you're differentiating yourself. And I know you've spoken about this in the past. That was one of the things that you felt differentiated yourself in the space, that you were so passionate about, not just for yourself. You wanted Blur to be a really successful band, not for yourself, but for them almost, and for the public to listen to them. And I think that's something in any career, it's worth reflecting on.
I think it was approaching them, and it was the same, I'd like to believe, with most of the artists I've signed. I really wanted them to succeed because I thought they were doing something artistically valid and special. It wasn't, I want you to succeed because I've signed you and you'll be great for my career. It was always, I love you. I want everyone else to love you as much as I do. And I believe we can make that happen. And I will do everything within my power to be successful. And I think they recognized that, almost dangerous level of drive and focus and ambition, and thought, if we when you're starting out with whatever you do in life, the more people you can bolt onto your team that have got, the kind of enthusiasm to achieve success that hopefully you have. And that's what I was saying earlier. The most important quality for anybody that you work with, and I think it's whatever business you're in, if you're in the business of spotting talent, and that might be executive talent as much as musical or artistic talent, it's all about spotting people that have got that drive and that ambition to succeed. And I think I certainly could see that in them, and I think they could see that in me. And we were of a similar age. I was a little bit older than them, but not much. So, and we had a very similar frame of reference. And I absolutely loved them as individuals, and hanging out with them was the most special experience for me. And even after sort of like I changed jobs 2 years after I signed them, I was still spending all my time in their company because, even though I wasn't working with them, I felt I was a massive advocate for everything they did all the time.
And then you went, you think, oh my God, you didn't know they were going to be one of the biggest bands, but you look back now and you think, where does it go from here? But you did go on to sign some great bands. That was really open. It seemed to me that success steamrolled from there. You did manage to just get on a roll. Is that fair to say?
To be honest, it went on a roll in that I went from working for a small music publishing company, MCA, to working for the biggest music publishing company in the world, EMI. So I had a reputation. The reputation definitely grew through working with Blur, and certain individuals, Dave Balfe and Andy Ross, who ran Food Records, Alan McGee, who ran Creation Records, they could see that I was out there doing good things, and they were keen to have me work with EMI Publishing, where they had publishing interests. I was recommended to EMI. I went to work there. It was very hard for me leaving Blur behind. But I knew that if I was to have a future in the industry, I had a better chance of having it at the number one publishing company. Because at the end of the day, no matter how much I might like to think it's all about me, it's about the deal. And I think what you can hope for is if the two deals are the same, your own personality will convince somebody to go with you rather than somebody else. And I felt if I go with EMI, I can feel confident that our deals are probably going to be better than anybody else's. And hopefully if I've got that with my personality, we'll be able to do some good deals. But that first year I had at EMI, I didn't sign anything that was any good. And I became increasingly, actually that's not fair. I signed a bunch of things that I loved, but they were not things that were connecting. I signed a great band called Adorable that were on Creation Records, a great band called Strange Love that were on Food Records, but they didn't really connect. I was becoming increasingly, I guess, cynical about music and the music industry, and I was about to give it all up and go to art school. I'd enrolled in Les Écoles de Beaux-Arts in Paris, and I was going to follow that dream of being a pure creative myself. And at the last minute, I'd been doing some work with Justine Frischmann, who was Damon Albarn's girlfriend, and she talked to me about getting a band together. And I'd been helping her put a band together, find musicians, been putting them into our studio at EMI. And at the end of the year, they demoed 3 songs in our studios. And they were, as far as I was concerned, the 3 best songs by an unsigned band I'd ever heard. And they were the Elastica demos. And I just thought, you know what? Let's give it one last roll of the dice. And so in 1993, I came back in again and, decided to give it a go with Elastica. And during 1993, the Elastica momentum built and built and built. And then going into 94, after Elastica, I signed Supergrass. Blur suddenly went from being a fairly successful band that had a good debut album, a critically acclaimed but not especially successful second album. Suddenly they had the biggest band in the year. Elastica were one of the biggest acts in the year. Supergrass were coming through and were huge. So all of a sudden it was just like, whoa, I'm on a hot streak. And from that point, it was also that, grunge was over and Britpop had absolutely begun. And the music that I'd always championed, that I'd always loved, this kind of derivative of punk and new wave and British music, British guitar bands, was suddenly front and center. And I was able to sign a lot of great acts, be it sort of like Teenage Fan Club, The Wannadies, Polly Harvey, Beth Orton, The Verve. All these things came together. Plus, I got to work with some amazing artists that we were involved with at the company, like Robbie Williams.
Whole different world.
So that was a whole different adventure that I went on. But it was an amazing time through that period in the 90s. But at the same time, it was a very hedonistic time, and it did definitely take its toll on all of us. And it was tough, sort of like running at that speed. And I think by the end of the late 80s, I was definitely starting to burn out and was finding it really,
to quote
really
the other
hard.
great artists of the 90s, you were partying a bit too much like it was 1999. Is that fair to say then?
Yeah. But it was absolutely, I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't do it. I was lucky, I'd met my life partner in 1994. She was actually a school friend of Alex James from Blur. So he introduced me to Joe. And I think I was really lucky to have a solid person around me in the 90s. It definitely kept me a bit more tethered. And we got married in 98, and we started a family in 2001. And with the birth of my first daughter, I decided to sort of like stop drinking and really live a much more together kind of existence. And it was interesting because I definitely thought, if I can't party hard with the artists, are they going to want to sign to me? Because you sort of, that was also probably part of my brand, my reputation. I was capable of staying up all night with the artists and, partying as hard as they could. And then all of a sudden I didn't. But I would still be going to all the shows I could. I would still stay up all night if need be, but I'd just be drinking Coca-Cola rather than... And I guess it helped that, one of the first bands I signed after I sobered up.
Oh my God, there's like...
So
the other end of the spectrum.
It was. I mean, I signed the Libertines and I signed the White Stripes. And I think when I did that, it proved to me that you didn't need to be
I guess it wasn't Beth Orton who was keeping you out till 4 o'clock in the morning then so much.
Believe me, Beth could certainly party. No, there were plenty of artists on my roster that could
you think,
keep me up
obviously
all
giving
night.
up drink is a big thing, but do you think that was also from... I mean, you are signing a wider range of artists. I mean, I've quoted Beth Orton, but she's not a band. She's a brilliant. Yeah. I love her stuff. But do you think that age and that confidence, and you don't have to prove anything either through your musical tastes or even your lifestyle, do you think that came with a bit of wisdom and age, that you could just be confident in yourself a bit more, Mike, at this point, really?
I think that's it. And that's why I really wanted to work with Robbie Williams. Because, I mean, to be honest, Robbie Williams to me was absolutely a Britpop artist. I felt the blueprint of what he was doing was like a slightly more mainstream version of what Oasis was doing. But to me, I wanted to work with an artist like that to prove to people who maybe had gone, oh yeah, Mike Smith, he's really good, but he's just an indie kid. And it was really good to work with somebody like Robbie Williams and show that I could work with very mainstream artists. And then going, and I worked with, slightly, I would have loved to have worked with more dance artists. I'd love to have worked with people like the Chemical Brothers and Daft Punk and Portishead, but we were quite siloed at work. There was like one guy would do the dance music, one guy, me, would do the rock alternative. The closest I could get were artists like the Avalanches or the Beta Band that I signed that were working with beats and break beats, but were still very much band orientated. But then I got to sign things like the Scissor Sisters, which, again, very much a band, but very,
absolutely.
Very much a mainstream pop act as well. And I think I definitely, like you said, I just felt much more confident and had an amazing run, sort of like in the early noughties with artists like Kasabian and the Coral and the Zootons, and Embrace and Arcade Fire from America. And, the last act I signed at EMI was the Arctic Monkeys. And it was interesting because I really thought the Arctic Monkeys were the last great British rock band because they were. I really thought they were so exceptionally good. I couldn't imagine a better band. And I'm still hard pressed to think, since 2005, who we've produced that is better. There's bands that are interesting, be it the 1975 or Wolf Alice, or more recently Fontaine's DC, that you think, well, they may go on to do interesting things, but nothing has the kind of ambition or depth that. It's amazing.
No, I suppose Muse might be bigger than DC Fontaine's and things, but they're not the Arctic Monkeys by any stretch of the imagination.
No, and they predate them. They're a 90s band like Coldplay. I think Muse and Coldplay are phenomenal bands. I think the Arctic Monkeys, in some way, also killed the scene, because as a result of them having success, there were hundreds, probably thousands of wannabe Arctic Monkeys that came along afterwards.
Yeah.
They were just a bit rubbish. And I was never interested. I didn't sign a British guitar band after the Arctic Monkeys for about 5 years. And it was lovely being able to pivot away from publishing and go and run a record label, because it gave me a chance to completely try something new. And the first things that I signed were all kind of like electronic pop.
It's quite interesting, Mike, and I see the wall of CDs behind you, and I'm interested in how that impacted the industry, because I'm just one person and then no necessarily a bellwether, but I think there's about 8 years where I just didn't buy any music. And I think CDs were almost, at least with vinyl you got something big, and then suddenly CDs are 12 quid, and I came back to I've got back into music via my son, and I'm like, where was I for the Offspring and new metal and System of a Down? It just all went completely. I listen to it now because I didn't listen to it in the 2000s to 2008. I just wonder if the CD, has the CD got a role in that itself, or do you just think it's the way the music scene developed?
I've always felt the CD was a very unsexy format. If I move around there, I much prefer the record collection side of what. That it is, and the problem with the CD is that it still feels like something you consume in the office at work. And the dual cases tended to snap. The good thing about a CD was that it was a format you could play in your car, and that's why it didn't get chewed up by the machine like cassette did. And I think that's certainly why I was buying CDs rather than vinyl, because it just meant I could just play it straight away in the car. But there was, as you went into after the early noughties, by 2006, 2007, by the time I got involved in the record business was actually in crisis, because you had a big problem with piracy. People, because of the explosion of the internet that was properly happening by about 2005, people were able to find whatever music they wanted online and burn their own CDs. You also then had the arrival of the digital download. So instead of if you wanted to listen to Hell's Bells by AC/DC, you had to buy Back in Black. You had to spend 12 quid buying Back in Black. And then suddenly Apple unbundled the album. So you just had to pay p to get the song that you wanted. So suddenly the revenue coming into record companies is going through the floor. And then the third blow was we were selling records, and to be honest, we were selling CDs mainly through supermarkets. And the supermarkets were just only interested in driving down the price of CDs to sub £5. So we went from selling a CD 14 quid to selling it for less than a fiver. We were selling one track instead of selling out CDs for 14 quid with 18 tracks on it. So the revenue that was coming into the music industry literally fell off a cliff. So I just think there was a real period around the time you're talking about where the industry was going through a real crisis of confidence. And I don't know if it really picked up again until probably about 2016,
so with all that in mind, this is the
2017.
point in time you decide to join the record industry, having signed the Arctic Monkeys, which I felt you're saying, I think you felt was a high. Where do I go from the Arctic Monkeys? You went to join a record company. And maybe before talking about yourself, Mike, again, for the uninitiated, which includes me, as an A&R man, you're signing a band to a publishing company. but then they sign to a record company. How does that work? Can you just explain that for the...
Of course. So a music publisher is responsible for the songwriter. The music publisher is there to add value to the work of the songwriter. It takes the song and it collects the royalties that are generated by that song and pays them through to the songwriter. Every time a song is played on the radio, every time a song is in a movie or an advert or a TV show, and every time a record is sold, every time a record is streamed, there is a certain percentage of money being generated that gets paid to the songwriter. And the music publisher is the one that collects that money and pays it through to the songwriter. And it takes a small percentage for doing that work. That's the job. So ultimately, being a talent scout and an A&R guy at a music publisher is all about going, I think they're going to be successful, giving all the advice you can to that artist to help them be successful. But ultimately, you're just on the sideline cheering them on. You go and join a record company. At a record company, you're working with the artist, who may be the songwriter, not necessarily, but you're working with the artist. You sign the artist, so you pay them a chunk of money like you did when you were in the publishing company. You pay them a chunk of money. But after you paid them a chunk of money to sign them, you then have to make the record. You've actually got to make something. So you've got to put them in the studio and then throw down another chunk of money to make the record with a producer. You're then working hard to advise them, help them to craft the best possible record. Then the fun starts, arguably, because you've got to market, promote, and sell that record. So you've got to suddenly start making videos, posters. You've got to give them money to go out on the road and promote the record. You've got to pay them money to go and do Later with Jules Holland or The Word or whatever. You are throwing down money every minute of the day trying to build them up. And whereas I always felt as a music publisher, you signed something, there wasn't a lot you could do to mess things up. In a record company, you could mess things up for an artist on a daily basis. You know, you going in and going, you know what, I don't think that's the right song. And that song that you just dismissed is Yellow by Coldplay. You know, if you make the wrong call, it can be absolutely devastating. Or more often, you know, you'd see people in my position saying, that's the single, and it wasn't the single. Or pushing the wrong tracks, spending far too much money on artists and on songs that weren't good enough. So there was, your ability to mess things up was enormous. So the stress levels, the responsibility was phenomenal. I really felt that I was far more responsible for the careers of the people I was working with when I was in a record company than I did in a music publishing company. But it was made for a very exciting time. And I was 40 years old when I made the jump from publishing to records. I could have stayed in publishing all my life, and it was arguably an easier career, but I wanted a new challenge. I felt I'd gone as far as I could go, and I wanted to go at a music publishing company, and I wanted to see if I could be good enough. And I think people were saying, look, you're at the top of your game in publishing. If it doesn't work out in records, you could always go back. And to be honest, most people that jumped from publishing companies to record companies tended to crash and burn. And I was very fortunate that I got to work with some really exceptional artists that enabled me to have a decent
So you joined
career
Columbia
in
Records and make this transition in 2006. And I think there's two aspects of that I'd like to explore with you, Mike. Is this the point in your career where you go from being fundamentally a music and musician-centric job to suddenly, if you're the managing director, it's like, there's the HR policy, there's the forecast from the head office or the shareholders, there's the health and safety, there's the relationships with the media. Was this the first job where actually, oh my God, I'm running this division and there's a whole bunch of management skills I've got to really be on top of very quickly? Was it before that in publishing, or was it both in the record industry?
I think in publishing, I became a director of the company around about 2001. Suddenly I became very aware that, you know, the behavior of our financial accounts was, you know, I was actually responsible for, and there were decisions that had maybe been taken before that I wouldn't have taken. So I definitely got a sense of responsibility, but I hadn't had although I'd had experience of managing, I was running a department within the publishing company. Suddenly to be running a record label with many departments within that company was something I was completely new to me. And the level of politics, which I knew really existed in the record business, and was one reason I'd really fought shy of, because it wasn't as political. Publishing's full of nice people. You know, the record business is a much more cutthroat place. And I think I came in as an MD, and I think a lot of other people felt that they should have been the MD as well. So I had to deal with a lot of politics, a lot of people that were out, I felt were potentially out to try and get my job. I had to convince everybody that I knew what I was doing when I'd never worked in a record company before. A tremendous amount of skills were needed that I hadn't necessarily had to call on before. A lot of emotional intelligence, a lot of corporate political skills. And I was lucky that I had a good boss who had also just stepped up to become the chairman of the company from being a record label head himself. So he was on a big learning curve. And he was quite sort of like progressive. He encouraged me to get a really good coach. And it was interesting seeing your conversation with an executive, a C-suite coach last week. And I was very fortunate to have somebody who could advise me and coach me and enable me to grow as an executive. And it was very much going from being a music fan to being a business person that was responsible for delivering a budget, but at the same time not losing any of those qualities that had made me good before. So I hope I just bolted a lot of life, good executive skills.
And did you enjoy it? I mean,
had.
did you thrive in it, or it's just pressure, hard work, which is, that's fine as well? Yeah.
I'd say it was 50-50, to be honest. There would be many times I would be absolutely destroyed by the end of the day. There were times when I would come home and burst into tears. I'd had such a really punishing day. And there was a lot about the job. The politics I really hated. But the compensations were off the scale. I was getting to work with Bruce Springsteen, Bob Dylan, the Foo Fighters, Kings of Leon, and they were all delivering great records. So I was there to oversee AC/DC's massive comeback, and the opportunity to spend time with that level of artists, as well as the new artists. We had a great roster of British acts with people like Kasabian and the Coral and the Zootons, but I was also able to bring in people like Calvin Harris and Mark Ronson and the Ting Tings, and international acts I signed like the Gossip and MGMT. So it was I loved the creative side of the job, and being able to handle the political and the executive side of it. I could do that, but I didn't relish it. I found that hard. But the compensation of being able to work on the creative side and work with an amazing bunch of people in terms of the people who were working in the label, they were very special people. And I felt we had a really good camaraderie within the label that I loved. I loved building culture within the label, and I did enjoy being a boss. But the broader, at the end of the day, I was essentially just running a division within Sony, and it was
building your own
tough.
team, and as you say, feeling if we're doing a good job, then you can take some pride in the performance of the whole team, not just yourself. I mean, that can be great.
And I'm bringing in executives into the team and helping to develop their careers. That was good, and I was really proud of some of the
And then,
people
as you just alluded to, from a subject matter expert perspective, I mean, it's great to build up Blurs and the Arctic Monkeys and the Kasabians, but it's very different talking to Bruce Springsteen and Foof and Dave Grohl in the 2000s. Like, there's only one way I can take this. So, I mean, what was that like? I mean, I'm sure interesting, challenging, privilege. You said privilege, I think, actually.
Yeah, absolutely a privilege. I mean, I'll never forget, driving home one evening on the phone to Bruce Springsteen's manager, and John Landau is going, "Mike, what do you think the first single should be?" And it's just like, I better make the right call here. This is, the first single from his new album. And suddenly, to have somebody who's, you talked about legends at the start. John Landau is one of the greatest music people that has ever lived. And to suddenly be able to have a dialogue with people like him, or John Silver, who managed the Foo Fighters and had managed Nirvana. That to me was a privilege on another level, to be able to interact and be involved in the day-to-day careers of some of the greatest artists that have ever existed. That was amazing, and I feel I'm so glad I did it, because it was, a lot of people said, "Are you sure?" I remember I went to tell my lawyer that I was taking the job at Columbia, and he just went, "Oh, well, that's a poisoned chalice, isn't it?" Because the Columbia gig had been a disaster. Sort of like for everyone who'd taken it before me, they'd lasted sort of like 2.5 years and got whacked. And it was one of these companies that just really released American repertoire, and that was all. And I was the first person in a long time that had really been able to break some British artists.
Was that where you broke Stormzy as well from a recording, or was that in your publishing journey that you?
No, that was in publishing. I mean, I left Columbia in 2012, and I went and did 5 years at Universal. First of all with Mercury, and then with Virgin EMI. And again, sort of like found myself a little bit siloed when I was working at Virgin, and I had a really lovely job there. I was president of music, which is a ridiculous title, but essentially I'd managed to push a lot of the executive stuff to one side, and I was just doing what I loved, which was making records. But it was very much, and I'd got to work with some of my biggest heroes. I'd made a record with Squeeze and brought them back, and they were back in the charts again. I'd re-signed the Libertines, and we were having big success with them. I'd brought the Chemical Brothers back, and they were having a lot of success, as well as working with people like Jake Bugg. But I could see that the thing that was really kicking off was British hip-hop. And it was just like, yeah, but Mike's this white guy in his 50s. There's nowhere, and it was really frustrating. And I remember I remember flying over to Spokane in Washington State in the Pacific Northwest, trying to sign Macklemore, because, I think it was about a few weeks after I'd started at Universal, and it was an amazing guy I worked with called Semtex, who was a brilliant hip-hop A&R guy. And we tried to do Macklemore together. And then we signed Iggy Azalea together, who was an Australian white female rapper, and we had quite a bit of success with her. And then we tried to, signed Lizzo for her first record, which was quite an underground record. And I loved working. Yeah, that to me was great. I've always loved hip-hop, and to be able to work with those kind of artists was fantastic. But then we had a change of management, and I very much felt I was getting pushed much more into, I made records with great people, people like Mike Oldfield or with Mika. But I wanted to be involved with some more cutting-edge British talent. And a friend of mine who I'd worked with, EMI Publishing, she was now working at Warner Chappell, and she was doing this amazing stuff with up-and-coming British hip-hop artists. And it just so happened that I was thinking about maybe switching back to publishing again. To be honest, wanting what I thought would be a slightly easier job than the one I was doing. Because, in 2015, I made 15 albums in 1 year. Now, when you think each album has, 12 songs and then B-sides and remixes, that's a lot of records. It's a lot of music in 1 year. And I was just exhausted. So I said I told my boss I wanted to do something different. And then I had an opportunity to go and run Warner Chappell, which was one of the big music publishing companies in the UK. And going over there was an opportunity to team up with a really great A&R person, a lady called Amber Davis. And she was signing some really great British hip-hop artists. So we got to work with Skepta, we got to work with Stormzy, I got to sign Dave and Jay Huss. So for me, it was an opportunity to be right back at the cutting edge of British music. I also signed Liam Gallagher, so it was an opportunity to finally because I'd tried really hard to sign Oasis and it had never happened. And I always felt really bad that Liam had got the rough end of the stick after the breakup of Oasis. And I loved Liam, and I thought he deserved a lot more. And that's one of the things I'm most proud of, to be involved in his career and bringing him back and really, being part of that journey that took him back to Nebworth again. So it was an interesting time being back involved in publishing.
So Mike, we go from
I'm glad I did it.
Warner Chappell, and then, again, my observation, relatively quickly, you move on to Downtown, and then you've actually, I don't know if you're still with them or you're doing part-time stuff with them, but you're officially retired, you're doing your own thing. Is this now part of the lifestyle versus work choice that, Warner Chappell to Downtown to moving to Spain? That seems to evolve quite quickly. Is that fair, or am I under?
Yeah, no. I mean, it was interesting. I went to Warner Chappell, and I really thought that was my last job. And I thought, I'm going to be here.
Yeah.
Hopefully, got 10 years, and I'll see myself out, and I'll be in my 60s, and I'll probably retire, and that'll be great. And what a lovely career. And it ended up my wife got quite sick while I was working at Warner Chappell, and it was a very stressful time. Suddenly looking after the family. We had 2 teenage daughters, and you just, as you always do, you very much take on that responsibility. I'm going to be optimistic. We're going to get through this, and thank God we did. But I think that definitely, I bottled up a lot of things dealing with that. And that was then combined with a change of management at Warner Chappell, and the guy that had hired me to run the company left to go and run Sony Music, and a new guy came in, and it didn't feel the same. And I've got to be honest, at the end of my time at Warner Chappell, I was just exhausted, and I was burnt out, and I was ready to retire. And I took some time out because I wasn't, I was definitely suffering mentally at that time. I needed time out of the industry, and I was probably ready to retire then. I was about 55, and my father retired at 55, so it had always been in my head that was a good age to get out. I hadn't got I want to be doing this for the rest of my life. I didn't feel the need to be doing that. And I was doing that, and I'd left Warner Chappell, and then I got a call from Downtown, which is an interesting company. It's a music publishing company, but it also has interests in record distribution and in the monetization of YouTube streams, online streams, royalty streams. Very progressive, independent music company. And they approached me and asked me if I wanted to be the global president of their publishing company. And I thought, well, that sounds interesting. I loved the idea of trying to discover new, if I was looking, I've always been hopefully about trying to find new stuff. And to me, the most exciting music being made was in South America, was in the Latin American countries, and was in Africa. I'd signed a kid called Remo when I was at Warner Chappell, who'd been, pretty successful coming out of West Africa. So I thought there was great stuff happening in Ghana and Nigeria, South Africa, great stuff happening in Spain and in South America. So the thought of doing a global job really appealed. And I went in to do that. To be honest, I think I was probably a little bit naive in thinking that this job was going to be another great creative job, because you're in charge of, a global business. And there was a lot of rationalization going on. And the company that owned Downtown, it wasn't a company, actually, it was a family that owned Downtown. They were looking to get some money out of the business. And so we had to sell a lot of the assets within the publishing company. And so I found myself getting involved in that sale and then the rationalization of the business. I've done that many, many times before. Sadly, I've had to restructure a lot of businesses in my time at records and at publishing. It's tough. Obviously, nobody likes making people redundant. Nobody likes closing offices. You want to be all about growth, investment. My time at Downtown, whilst we did some great things and signed some fantastic artists, there was a lot of restructuring ultimately as we prepared the company for sale. And recently, Downtown the plan is to sell to Universal now. So it was always building towards that. And I just thought, you know what? The thing that I loved in the music industry, the discovery of new talents, that's a very, very small part of this job. And when I knew I was coming to the end of my contract there, I just went, this isn't what I want to be doing anymore. And I reached that point, and there were a bunch of things going on. I think I'd also reached the point where I didn't particularly want to live in England anymore. And so Joe came up with the idea of let's relocate to Spain. I'm fortunate that I have an Irish passport, so I'm an Irish citizen by foreign birth, so it's easy for me to live in Europe. And also by moving to Spain, I don't have to answer too many questions from people who say, "Oh, what are you doing now?" Because if I go out in London, I bump into people and it's always, "What are you doing now?" And it's just, if you sort of like say, "Well, I'm sitting at home painting, doing a bit of writing," you can see their faces drop and they want to hear about what new artists you're working with. So it was coming to Spain was very much tied into my decisions to step back from corporate life in the music industry. And I think when I first came out here, there were a number of things that I was keeping going. I was involved with my mate Ben, that I've talked about a bit in the podcast, but we were running a record label together called Scared Hitless, and we put out a compilation with a band called Boys Wonder that we loved, and we put out a record of theirs that they made in the 1980s but never got released. So that was a really great thing to be involved in, helped them come back and do some gigs. So that was a lot of fun. But ultimately for me, it was a way to pick up from myself at 18. And that boy that actually maybe did go to art school and did become a painter. So I've started exhibiting. I've always painted, always done drawings. So I started exhibiting the paintings and drawings around Spain. So I've done 3 exhibitions over here. And I've been helped in that by a good friend of mine who lives in Spain, which is Al Macaulay, who's the drummer in Mrs. Mill's Party. So again, going right back to where we started our conversation, Al did history of art and was always a big champion of my painting. He helped me get my first exhibition together. Wow. He was a framer at the time, so he framed all my paintings, yeah. But through his connections in the cultural scene in Spain, he's been helping me get art exhibitions going. And the flip side of that is that he's got a fantastic band called Three Head, which is a kind of dubby trip hop kind of outfit. And I helped him get in the studio with Youth, who's an incredible producer, produced urban hymns for The Verve. He's worked with Paul McCartney, was the bass player in Killing Joke. He's an amazing guy. He's got a studio about an hour from here in the Sierra Nevada. So I helped Al get in there, and we're hopefully going to be he's going to be releasing a record with Three Head doing that. So it's been nice having those kind of little projects. I'm involved with an environmental charity called Earth Percent. I'm a trustee of that charity, and that helps channel music from the music industry into environmental charities. And one of the things I'm most proud of is I'm involved with a small music venue in Birkenhead, which is the town I grew up in Merseyside. And it's a fantastic venue. It's a 280 capacity venue. We're in the process of getting planning permission together to build a 700 capacity room there. And I really believe that through this venue, we're going to be part of transforming Birkenhead and getting it back together again. And I was over there last week, up in Merseyside, and we were talking about the regeneration that we were hoping to see happen. And it just occurred to me the irony of sort of like this town that my dad, us as a family, had to leave because it was so beat up in the 80s. The regeneration of this town is the one bit of optimism I find in the world at the moment. At a time when there's a lot of news you don't really want to be listening to. Right. It's so lovely being involved in trying to help people make music at a grassroots level, and hopefully, helping people right at the start of their music career. So for me, that's great. And that's the level of involvement I want in the music industry right now. I feel I've done, when you've worked with Bob Dylan, it's just like, yeah.
I know, exactly.
Who else do you want to work with? It's just like, I've been really fortunate, I'm in awe of these people that just keep on fighting and fighting every day, going out and just basically doing everything they can to make sure their company and their business and their artists stay at the very top of their game. And that's a phenomenal achievement. But I guess I just wanted to try some other things. Who knows how long we're all going to be here for?
It's
So
one
in
of
the
the
time
reasons
I've
I
got
started this
left,
podcast, Mike, is to discuss with people. I mean, I think I haven't thought of a better word, but you're not really retired because you're as busy now as you ever were. But we haven't come up with a better word for it yet.
Yeah.
But so we'll use it for now. But the concept of retiring is really outdated. I mean, especially in the music industry where, between even if you go to the top, Mick Jagger, Paul McCartney, and then you work down to Alice Cooper, and they're all in their 60s and 70s. Yeah. So I think less the bodies, but the spirit of music lives till whatever age you can make it to. And why not live your own life in that spirit, whether you're in the music industry or not? I'm just going to get the most out of it that I can, frankly.
Yeah, you don't stop being, and I think you don't stop being a performer. And I think, if you're working in a corporation, that is a punishing job. And I don't, some people are able to do that job in their 60s and their 70s. And I wasn't interested in that. I could see the toll that it took on me. And I just wanted to try some other things. I'd had to put so many things in my life to one side. And it was just really important to me. I definitely feel like I needed to set things down for my children. And that's why I love the opportunity I've got to write at the moment. And I've been writing a lot about our time together at university. So it's very much in the front of my mind at the moment. And I feel really lucky that I still have really strong relationships with everybody from university, from school, as well as from my career in the music industry.
So maybe a couple of questions to close, Mike. I mean, the first one that's got is, it always amazes me that the Spotify top 10 is basically 10 TikTok songs in a row, maybe with the odd Bruno Mars or Kendrick Lamar song thrown in, depending on the month. But if you go to Reading Festival or Glastonbury or any of the European festivals, you've got a bunch of 18-year-olds singing every single word, whether it's whatever artist from the 90s. And it's a dichotomy, right? How come they know all the words to the band, the guitar-based band or synth-based bands, but all the records are based on TikTok? And can we ever get back to a blended charts, or is it just the way the charts work that will never happen again?
Well, I think it's interesting. If you look at, say, the Brit Awards, there's still a great deal of variety there. And I always take great solace from the Brits and sitting there thinking, well, I don't think it's beyond the bounds of possibility that I could have signed that artist and that artist and that artist. I don't feel that I'm completely out of touch with things that are going on. I see a lot of artists that are new, that are coming through, that I absolutely love, that I feel, I would have loved to have worked with. So I think we have to remember that Spotify is a tech platform, and it's driven by algorithms. And it also fed into, people are uploading music from every single corner of the globe. So it's very different to the old days when the power rested within what the record companies could do in the UK and America. And that's definitely a big part of why the UK is no longer, punching above its weight like it used to. It's just one country alongside Nigeria. Nigeria is probably going to become a lot more important than the UK. There's going to be 100 million people living there soon. So South America is massively overachieving. West Africa, massively overachieving. England, I would say, underachieving a little bit. And I think the business is definitely slipping into, you have what goes on online, and music that is driven by TikTok and driven by an algorithmic fluency is going to sometimes be very different to the music that works well at Glastonbury and at all the festivals that you're going to want to go and see, as well as all the heritage artists you're going to want to see at those festivals. So, I love that so many of the bands I used to work with in the 90s are out there making a decent living, essentially doing exactly the same as they were in the 90s.
No, you've probably got more examples, but it gives me hope. She's American, but it gives me hope that Chapel Roan can just turn up, in a big ginger wig and white face and just, well, what's that about? Well, it's brilliant. And I'm sure you've got more examples than I have, but that gives us hope, right? In terms of
absolutely, and I mean it takes longer to develop those artists. I mean Lola Young, who's obviously just having a massive moment with Messi at the moment. You know, Lola was signed in 2019. She'd been developed as an artist for 2 years before that. So that's you're looking at 7 years before she has her first big hit single. You know, everything takes time these days, but I still believe the artistry will out.
well,
You know, the charts has always been full of crap, but there's
that
always
is
great
true. If you
stuff
watch
in
the Top
there.
of the Pops from 1984, there is an awful lot of rubbish smattered in between the good songs.
Yeah. And 1984 is one of the most exciting times for music. So much fun. I mean, I feel between 78 and 84, there's so much progressive, challenging, interesting music in the charts. But there's an awful lot of there's a lot of Bucks Fizz as well. You know, and there will always be lightweight, disposable, manufactured froth because there's lots of people out there doing that stuff. And that's absolutely fine. And I guess I am, you know, it's very arrogant of me to say that there's a lot of rubbish in the charts because for a lot of other people, that's not rubbish. That's stuff that they love as much as I love the artists I love.
Yeah, I mean,
but it's, you know, I feel still very optimistic. And even though, you know, the people that are doing my job now have a very different approach to it, and almost immediately that they hear something they like, they're checking to see how many followers and streams it's had, as opposed to going, I think this is great, let's do it. I want to believe that, you know, the A&R people that are out there still have their heart and soul in music.
Maybe to sort of close, Mike, what would you tell the 18-year-old Mike Smith in 2025? I mean, what is the equivalent now of go start in the post room? I mean, no one gets any post wandered around the building anymore. What would be the equivalent that you would give advice would you give to somebody to say, look, if you are absolutely passionate about music and you want to give it a go, and that's fine. What would be your advice to that person or those individuals?
Just go out and do it. You know, don't wait for somebody to offer you a job. You know, find your mates that are making music, and if you want to do what I did, help them. You know, help them blow up on TikTok, blow up on Instagram, help them get followers, help them build a community around them. Just get involved. You know, you're not going to get paid for doing that initially. You know, you're probably going to have to do a job that you're not going to particularly like, but that will support you. And, you know, with every free moment you have, help your friends that are making music and make yourself indispensable. Be the person that's doing their social media campaign. Be the person, you know, if there's still bands. Look, one of the biggest artists in the UK at the moment is Ray. So the first time I encountered Ray, she was playing the Hoxton Bar and Grill. So, you know, whatever people say about small venues, you know, are they really part of what goes on live music? Is it really what it's all about? Absolutely it is, because it's the quickest way of telling you whether that artist is for real. And Ray was brilliant and really special when I saw her in the Hoxton Bar and Grill in 2016. So the importance of small venues is absolutely crucial. Being able to see, you know, Lola Young, you know, again, first time I saw her was in a pub in Brighton. You know, it's all about, I still think, that grassroots thing in rehearsal rooms, in small venues around the country. That's why, you know, I'm working in a small venue now, and that's if I'm after I do this call, I'm jumping on a call with the architect to sort of like talk about helping to build a bigger room. You know, that's where the consistency lies. But if I'm telling my younger self, it's just get involved. You know, I feel really lucky that the decisions I took, you know, most of them were the right decisions. There were the wrong I probably. Right. I mean, I worked too hard in that I went out every night. And in order to survive going out every night, I drank and took drugs to power myself through it. And you can only do that for so long. And I was lucky that I had enough good people around me, and I stopped and I built a really good career and a good life for myself. Not everybody else that I knew that was following that path did. But I think if I was to had a message for my younger self, it would be just take it a little bit easier on yourself. You know, have a night off, go to the movies once a week.
But I think, Mike, I mean, we're all on our own individual journeys, and I'm delighted for you, but I'm delighted for all of us to think. I mean, what I see that you've got for yourself now is just like, wow, what a lovely mix of Spain, sunshine, helping young people, charitable work, toe still in the record industry, pursuing your passion for art, and you've got a mate who you've reconnected with who lives around the corner. I mean, wow, right? And we've all got to find our own wow.
Yeah.
Whether it's in corporate life today or whether it's in that retired state in the future. And I'm so delighted that you spent the time today and you found, I'm sure there's many twists and turns to come, and I look forward to seeing you again in the UK, but I'm just so delighted your current path has got you to where you're really happy and enjoying yourself.
No, thanks, Pete. And I mean it from the bottom of my heart. I'm really happy that we're still talking to each other, and it's. I think, again, if I'd have known at 18 that I'd be still connected to so many people who were important in my life then, and they're still important in my life now, that would have been lovely to know. And I think being able to reach out over the decades and go, it's going to be okay.
Well, it was great. I think I don't know how long these sort of we were all busy patch in the middle, but I think you were one of the chief instigators of getting us all back together, and it's been absolutely delightful for the last probably 4-5 years. And you were definitely one of the you and our friends, one of the chat user groups during COVID that kept us going with, name all these top 20s from the 80s, or, whatever WhatsApp quiz we played. And it was just great to have that community when we were all at home and navigating our way through it.
That's what we needed. Yeah. And it's, I'm a big, the friends that you make when you're young, I mean, you often, I don't want to see them again. They've all changed so much, but I definitely feel maybe we were lucky, the things that made those people special then, I think we're very fortunate. They're still very special people. In the famous lines of the Blues Brothers, I hear you do have an aspiration to put the bands back together. Maybe we'll get that on this YouTube channel later in the year and have a few videos of that as well to share with everybody. 17th of October, 100 Club. Brilliant. Those bands are going to be back together. Mike, look forward to that, and thanks for your time today, and take care. Cheers, man. Bye. Absolute pleasure. See you soon, man. Bye.